Imagine being surrounded by death day after day. Imagine watching people's faith slowly fade away, and yet somehow finding a supernatural strength to keep going. This is the story of a Christian doctor who faced the darkest moment of modern humanity and found meaning where there was only despair. Stay until the end and discover the lesson that saved not only physical lives, but souls lost in complete darkness. March 2020. St. Gabriel's Medical Center in New York was no longer the same hospital where Dr. Henrique had worked for the past 18 years. Once, his routine consisted of routine checkups, minor procedures, and predictable shifts. Now, the emergency rooms were overwhelmed, the hallways had turned into makeshift ICUs, and the sound of mechanical ventilators filled the air like an unrelenting chorus of battle. The staff's faces bore deep eye bags and expressions of exhaustion. Dr. Henrique had always been known for his calm demeanor, but even he now felt the crushing weight of the situation. The coronavirus not only claimed lives at a terrifying rate, it also broke the spirits of those fighting to save them. That morning, as he arrived for his 16-hour shift, he glanced at the patient board in Wing C. In less than 48 hours, 4 of the patients he had treated had died. Some were elderly. Others were far too young to be at the end of their lives. Dozens still struggled to breathe. "Accept what you cannot change and fight for what you can," he muttered to himself, the first of many times he would repeat that phrase throughout the day. When he entered room 312, Henrique found 72-year-old patient Alice Thompson. She wore an oxygen mask and her eyes reflected sheer exhaustion. "Doctor," she whispered, pulling down the mask for a moment. "Am I going to die alone?" He swallowed the bitterness rising in his throat. "Never," he said. "As long as I'm here, you will never be alone." Back in the break room, Henrique pulled a small book from the pocket of his white coat. Meditations by Marcus Aurelius. The writings of this Roman emperor had become a compass in the midst of chaos. Adversity introduces a man to himself. Perhaps this was his ultimate test. St. Gabriel's Medical Center was among the many hospitals in New York facing the overwhelming crisis of the pandemic. Once full of chatter between nurses in the corridors and patients strolling through the lobby, the building now resembled a besieged fortress. Masks, gloves, and disposable gowns had become armor, while healthcare professionals waged war against an invisible enemy. Dr. Henrique Ferreira, 45, was a Brazilian general practitioner who had been working in the U.S. for nearly 2 decades. He had always been respected for his ethics and professionalism, but in the face of the pandemic, he found himself challenged like never before. His sense of duty was unwavering, but each patient lost left an invisible scar. Among his colleagues, he particularly admired Dr. Sophie Langston, a young, highly skilled intensivist who had joined the hospital just 2 years prior to the pandemic. Sophie had been energetic and optimistic, but in recent weeks something in her seemed dimmed. "Henrique," she said one night in the cafeteria, shrugging over a cup of cold coffee, "sometimes it feels like we're not saving anyone. We're just delaying the inevitable." "What if it's not about stopping death?" Henrique replied, recalling a thought borrowed from Seneca, "but about making sure no one dies alone." Another unforgettable figure was Nurse Jason Park, the son of Korean immigrants working impossible hours and staying strong for his patients. He shared Henrique's stoic outlook, facing the storm without panic but also without illusions. And of course there were the patients. Alice Thompson, the elderly woman who had spoken with Henrique that morning, was just one among many facing the horror of isolation in the hospital. With visits forbidden, Henrique and his fellow doctors had become the sole human presence in the lives of those fighting for each breath. As he walked through the hospital's corridors, Henrique came to understand that his mission was not only medical, it was humanitarian. The days began to blur into one another, endless shifts, alarms ringing constantly, and tired eyes hidden beneath N95 masks. There were daily losses, among both patients and the healthcare workers themselves, many of whom eventually fell ill under the overwhelming pressure. Dr. Henrique Ferreira observed the growing list of cases that spilled into the corridors. More and more young people were arriving in critical condition, many with no pre-existing conditions. "I lost 2 more today," Sophie confessed, leaning against the wall outside the medication room, her eyes hollow. "Me too," Henrique replied, his voice hoarse with fatigue. But the most harrowing moments came when he had to call the families of intubated patients, letting them know there was nothing else that could be done. "But he was fine yesterday," sobbed the wife of a 47-year-old man. "You said he was stable." In that context, the word stable seemed to lose all meaning. Henrique tried to reply, but he realized there were no right words to ease that kind of pain. Increasingly, he sought refuge in his Stoic books. When the emotional storm threatened to tear everything apart, he would read, "If it is not within your control, accept it. The only insurmountable enemy of man is fate itself." By applying those teachings to his routine, he began to feel a subtle transformation. Rather than despair at each loss, he started to accept that some battles couldn't be won, only faced with dignity. One night, Jason Park found him in the locker room, holding meditations in his hands. "How do you keep going without losing your mind?" the nurse asked, sinking into a worn-out chair. Henrique paused before replying, "Because my mission isn't to stop death, Jason. My mission is to make sure no one faces it alone." The words lingered in the air, and for the first time in weeks, Jason smiled. With each passing day, Henrique understood his role more deeply. He wouldn't be able to save all the COVID-19 patients, but maybe, just maybe, he could preserve their humanity amid the chaos. The chaos in the hospital wasn't only physical, it was psychological. With every patient lost, the medical team sank further into an exhaustion that seemed to have no end. Jason Park, long seen as unshakable, began showing signs of emotional fatigue. His movements slowed. His eyes were often glassy with tears. "Did you sleep at all?" Henrique asked, finding him slouched at the nurse's station, staring blankly at a patient's chart. "A few hours," Jason replied, but the expression on his face told a different story. That same week, the young nurse lost a close colleague to COVID-19, and when healthcare workers themselves began dying, the question became even more haunting. If not even those on the front lines were safe, who was? Meanwhile, Sophie Langston had started avoiding Henrique. They used to share coffee breaks, exchanging quick conversations about the day's challenges. Now she barely looked in his direction. One night, he found her sitting alone behind the hospital, smoking a cigarette, a habit he had never seen in her. "You don't smoke." "Apparently I do now," she replied flatly. "What's going on?" She let out a dry laugh before answering. "I don't know how much longer I can keep watching people die and not be able to do anything about it." Henrique inhaled deeply. He knew he couldn't offer her any false comfort, only the truth. "Then stop trying to defeat death. Try to ensure each life, until the last moment, holds some meaning." Those words would eventually settle within her, but in that moment, Sophie simply dropped the cigarette and crushed it under her shoe without making any promises to change. The pandemic wasn't just destroying bodies, it was corroding souls. Weeks turned into months. April gave way to May, and the pandemic showed no signs of slowing. St. Gabriel's medical center had been operating beyond capacity for a long time, but the patients kept coming. That's when Henrique received the news he feared most. During the shift change, one of the supervisors pulled him aside. There was something in the man's eyes that spoke of impending heartbreak. "Henrique, I need to let you know. Jason tested positive." The words hit like a punch to the gut. Jason Park. Henrique had seen him just the night before, exhausted but composed, caring for a critical patient. "How is he?" "High fever, trouble breathing. He's being moved to the isolation wing." It was the embodiment of every fear that haunted the hospital hallways. Jason Park wasn't just a dedicated nurse. He was one of the last emotional anchors holding the team together. His absence would be deeply, brutally felt. Henrique felt fear rise within him, only to be compressed by the same stoic acceptance he had used to tame his panic day after day. He closed his eyes and remembered Epictetus's words. "Do not seek for events to happen as you wish, but wish for them to happen. As they do, and your life will be serene." But could he really accept this? Could philosophy truly hold him together in this moment? That night, after his rounds, he found Sophie, For the first time in weeks, it was she who sought him out. "Henrique, if Jason doesn't make it, I don't know what I'll do." Without hesitation, he took her hands, a rare gesture given how strictly they had avoided physical contact. "You'll keep going, Sophie, because the pain of losing someone cannot be the reason we abandon those who can still be saved." Took a deep breath, clutching those words like someone fighting not to drown. Jason was now the patient, and Henrique could only hope that this time they might succeed in saving one of their own. The days that followed were the hardest Henrique had faced since the beginning of the pandemic. Each shift felt heavier, and the hospital was submerged in a terrible silence. The silence of doctors and nurses who, no matter how trained and resilient, were emotionally at their limit. The absence of Jason Park made this all the more evident. Henrique realized how much the nurse had been an anchor for the team. His calm energy, his pragmatic attitude in the face of chaos, all of that was sorely missed. Sophie, debilitated by the emotional exhaustion of the past months, withdrew even more. She avoided long conversations and spent less time in the cafeteria, immersing herself in work as a form of escape. Henrique himself began to feel the effects of accumulated stress. He was sleeping less, eating little, and sometimes felt his heart racing for no reason. One afternoon, while reading meditations in the small hospital break room, one of the interns found him. He was a young doctor, clearly an admirer of Henrique. "Dr. Ferreira, how do you keep going?" Henrique closed the book and observed him for a moment. "Because this fight isn't about me. It's not about us, the doctors. It's about every life we can still make more dignified." The young doctor nodded, trying to absorb those words, but Henrique knew that sometimes saying something profound wasn't enough to change reality. And at that moment, deep down, he carried the fear that Jason might not return. Until 2 nights. Later, his phone vibrated. It was a message from Sophie. Jason woke up. He's off the ventilator. Henrique felt something rare. Amid so many days of despair, he felt hope. Jason Park's recovery brought a rare moment of relief for the hospital team. It was as if a small victory had been won amidst so many losses. For Henrique, seeing a friend come back from the brink of death was a powerful reminder. Not everything was beyond his control. Days later, when he was finally allowed to visit Jason in the recovery ward, he found him sitting up in bed, still, with nasal oxygen but smiling weakly. "You have no idea how bad it is to be a patient in this hospital," Jason joked, his voice hoarse. Henrique smiled. It had been a long time since he had genuinely smiled. "Well, I suggest you don't try to repeat the experience." The conversation was brief, as Jason still tired easily, but the essential message was conveyed. Jason would return, and, with him, a bit of the strength the hospital team so desperately needed. Jason's recovery also had an unexpected effect on Sophie Langston. She began spending more time in the break room with Henrique. One night, she picked up his small copy of Meditations and flipped through it, curious. "Do you really believe that accepting what we can't change is the way?" Henrique observed her for a moment before replying, "It's not about resignation, Sophie. It's about choosing where to spend our energy. Do you think you can control the virus, the deaths, the chaos?" She sighed. "No. But you can control your response to all of this, and you can choose to fight the best way possible." For the first time in a long while, she seemed willing to listen to those words. That night, Sophie asked to borrow his copy of Marcus Aurelius, The Why. Pandemic wasn't over, but little by little, Henrique saw those around him finding ways to bear the weight of this battle. The hospital was still at its limit, but something had changed. Jason's recovery, the more confident glances exchanged among the team, and Sophie's subtle shift indicated a renewed resilience. Henrique noticed it in the small details. The fatigue was still there, but now it was accompanied by a clearer sense of purpose. They would suffer losses, but every life saved mattered. His team was stronger, and he felt it within himself as well. Then came the next big test. It was an intense night at St. Gabriel's Medical Center. The emergency room was packed, the ventilators were at their limit, and a new outbreak in the city indicated that the worst days were far from over. That's when Sophie approached Henrique with an urgent look. "I need you in the ICU now." "We have a critical case." They ran down the corridor, masked, covered in heavy PPE, and entered the ICU. On the gurney was Evan Thompson, the grandson of Alice, the elderly woman Henrique had cared for over the past month. The 14-year-old was admitted with severe respiratory failure. Henrique's chest tightened. They had lost Alice a few weeks earlier, and now her grandson was here, suffering from the same disease. But unlike Evan's grandmother, he still had a chance. In that moment, Henrique realized that everything he had been through had prepared him for this. The chaos was all around him, but within, there was serenity. "We're going to do everything we can to save him," he said to Sophie, with unshakable conviction. Evan would not be just another patient. He would be a symbol. Henrique couldn't save everyone, but he could still save someone, and in that moment that was enough. Evan Thompson's heart monitor beeped frenetically as his breathing became increasingly irregular. Henrique felt an enormous weight on his chest, but he didn't let it overwhelm him. Not there, not at that moment. He took a deep breath and focused. "We need more oxygen now," he ordered the team, while Sophie prepared for intubation. Time seemed to move in a distorted way. Seconds dragged on like hours. Every decision could determine the boy's fate. Henrique absorbed those moments as if they were frozen in time. As Marcus Aurelius had written, "What is happening now has happened before and will happen again." He saw the fear in Evan's eyes, even under the oxygen mask. The boy was conscious enough to know his life was hanging by a thread. Henrique held his hand, just as Evan had held Alice's weeks before. "Stay with me, kid. Breathe. I'm here." Evan's eyes were full of terror, but also trust. Then, in a coordinated movement, the team proceeded with the procedure. The tube was inserted, and the ventilator took over the work of breathing for him. The first few minutes were tense. The oxygenation level took time to stabilize, but it did stabilize. When the monitor began to show better readings, Sophie allowed herself to exhale, her trembling hands leaving the sides of the bed. "Did we make it?" Jason asked, watching from a corner. Henrique looked at the boy and knew there was still a long road ahead, but Evan Thompson had a real chance of survival. He closed his eyes and repeated to himself, "What matters is not the length of life, but the quality of the moments lived, and today we won another battle." Evan Thompson remained hospitalized for weeks, slowly going through the recovery process. With respiratory therapy sessions and a dedicated medical team, the boy overcame the critical phase. When he was finally discharged, Henrique was there to see him leave the hospital, this time in a wheelchair pushed by his father. "You were strong, Evan," Henrique said, kneeling beside him. "Your grandmother would be proud of you." Boy looked at him with silent gratitude and nodded. As he watched Evan being taken home, Henrique realized something he hadn't felt since the start of the pandemic: genuine hope. Not because everything was over, nor because the losses were fewer, but because he had learned to accept the cycle of life and focus on what was within his control. Sophie, standing beside him, exuded a different aura. The conversations about Stoicism seemed to have had an effect on her. "Do you still think we're not saving anyone?" Henrique asked. Sophie crossed her arms and smiled for the first time in a long while. "Maybe I need to reconsider that." Henrique laughed, feeling a weight lift off his shoulders. The hospital would never be the same. Neither would he. But for the first time, he understood that this wasn't a bad thing. It was just life taking its course. And he would remain there, ready to face any new challenge with serenity. Months later, when the worst days of the pandemic were behind them, Henrique returned to reading meditations during his breaks at the hospital. But now he wasn't alone. On a quiet afternoon, Sophie sat beside him and pulled a small book from her coat pocket. "You'll like this one," she said, handing him a copy of Letters to Lucilius by Seneca. Henrique smiled. His legacy wasn't just about saving lives, but teaching others to cope with the uncertainty of existence. As he flipped through the book, he felt that in some way he had fulfilled his purpose. And that was enough. Dr. Henrique's story reminds us that amid chaos, serenity is a choice. We can't always change the events around us, but we can decide how to react to them. Now I ask you, how do you face the inevitable challenges of life? What can you change and what must you wisely accept? Share your reflections in the comments and pass this story on to someone who might be inspired by the strength of Stoicism. After all, true healing often begins in the mind.